Hey, Levi here. On July 31st, the Nintendo Game Boy turns 20 years old. 2 decades ago, after having completely dominated the living room with the NES, Nintendo decided it wanted every other room too. And the car, and the train, and the plane, you get the idea. Gunpei Yokoi, one of Nintendo's greatest inventors and game makers, decided to make such a device with Nintendo's famous Research and Development 1 team. The result was the Game Boy, a monochromatic handheld. Although bulky in size and with a rather bland appearance, the Game Boy totally revolutionized on-the-go gaming. And thanks to the phenomenal popularity of Tetris and Pokemon, Nintendo's Game Boy was crowned the undisputed champion of pocket gaming, selling almost 120 million units worldwide with its variety of models, including the Game Boy Pocket and the Game Boy Color. Now you throw in the Game Boy Advance, and the Game Boy family of handhelds tops 200 million sold. Since then, no other handheld, not even the Nintendo DS, has even come close. Before the Game Boy, the portable gaming scene had no dominant player. Nintendo had its classic Game & Watch handhelds, which included games like Manhole, Octopus, and Mario Cement Factory. Nintendo also competed with Coleco and others in the tabletop scene, those miniature plastic arcade cabinets, based on popular arcade games of the time. In 1982, NTEX released AdventureVision, which was similar to the classic tabletops, but used cartridges to load various games. Although the red LED-only AdventureVision, which unfortunately sounds a lot like the Virtual Boy, was too big to be considered a truly portable gaming rig. Now, far closer to the Game Boy was the Microvision. Released in 1979, Microvision is the first true portable gaming system that used cartridges.
So here it is. This is the Microvision. If you owned this back in 1979, you were the envy of the schoolyard. The Microvision is pretty much what the Game Boy is today. It had replaceable cartridges. When you bought the game, it came with Blockbuster, which was Breakout. But you could, buy games like bowling. There was a Connect 4 game for it, but there was only 12 games, and that's pretty much why it failed.
The Microvision only lasted for 2 years before fizzling, but it laid the groundwork for Nintendo 10 years later. However, the Game Boy came close to not being the first new handheld to market in 1989. A developer called Epyx was also working on its own handheld called the Handy, which was later sold to Atari and eventually became the Lynx. The Lynx's specs trumped the Game Boy in almost every single category. It had a bigger screen, it was in full color, and it had some pretty cool looking games on the way that made the black and white Super Mario Land look anemic by any comparison. But Nintendo had a secret weapon: Tetris.
Tetris was pretty much synonymous with the Game Boy's success. When, Nintendo was first considering shipping the Game Boy, they were thinking about packing in Super Mario Land. But Hank Rogers from Bulletproof Software, the guy who actually got the game out of the Soviet Union and, into the Game Boy, said, if you want to sell the Game Boy to kids, pack in Mario Land. If you want to sell it to everyone, pack in Tetris.
It attracted a huge audience way beyond the hardcore gamer crowd, perhaps the genesis of Nintendo's design philosophy with the DS and the Wii. With games like Tetris and Super Mario Land, Nintendo had no trouble overtaking the Lynx and torpedoed Sega's Game Gear, which was another color handheld that was also more powerful. The Game Boy family later grew to contain new models, such as the thinner Game Boy Pocket and the Game Boy Color, but over time the Game Boy started to show its age. It needed a new hero, and Mario wasn't going to cut it. Nintendo needed a fresh face. 151 fresh faces, to be exact.
Yeah, of course we can't talk about Game Boy without talking about Pokemon, probably the most gigantic franchise in the history of all time, outside of maybe the Fat Plumber.
Nintendo really designed this around the Game Boy, the idea of taking your system with you, because you collected all your Pokemon and you wanted to battle your friends and trade these Pokemon with your friends, and the Game Boy allowed that through the use of the link cable.
And it was basically like a crack addiction for kids. You had multiple versions of a game come out, you have red and I have blue and we can't get the same Pokemon, but we're either going to trade or convince our parents to buy us the same game over again just because we want them all. It was a whole nother era that is still continuing.
Released in Japan in 1998 and a year later in America, Pokemon completely revitalized the Game Boy. Pikachu and the rest of the Pokemon became global superstars, raking in billions for Nintendo in games and merchandise. But despite Pokemon's success and the popularity of the Game Boy Color, the hardware was looking a little creaky. So in 2001, Nintendo finally made a move to turn the boy into a man with the Game Boy Advance. It was basically a portable Super Nintendo, but with just a little more kick. The Game Boy Advance flew off shelves like mad, despite its initial unimpressive design, landscaped with a non-backlit screen. Nintendo later upgraded the Game Boy Advance to the SP, which featured a cool clamshell design. Remember, this is when flip phones were all the rage. The SP model was responsible for over half of the Game Boy Advance's 80 million units sold. 2005's hip Go-Go Game Boy Micro? Not so much.
I think originally Nintendo wanted the Game Boy Micro to be a mass-market device, something like the iPod Nano, something smaller that everybody could take with them, put into their pocket. Unfortunately, it was very expensive. It was outdated from a technology standpoint, and it really didn't have that broad appeal that a Nintendo DS had, and so it failed miserably.
Despite plans to have the DS become the so-called third pillar of the Nintendo family, its runaway success in 2004 marked an end to the Game Boy era. But even though the Game Boy line is out of production, its influence still reverberates through the industry. Now, whether you played the original Game Boy, the Pocket, the Color, or the Advance, there is no disagreement. The Game Boy line is one of the most important handhelds. Actually, it's one of the most important systems in the history of gaming. And so IGN is proud to wish the Game Boy a happy 20th birthday. Next year, the first drink is on us.